we shall have the discussion by Professor Josephine Ayikira. I'll introduce her at that time when she's discussing the paper, when she's discussing the book rather. And after her discussion, if there are any issues that Professor Ayikira wants to respond to, she can respond. Then we shall open the plenary and have comments from the audience both in the room and online. So after that, we'll have again a response from the author if there is any, and we'll end with a photo moment. So you're most welcome. Allow me to introduce our guest today, the author of the book that some of us have had the privilege to read. We circulated some copies of the text, soft copies, but we are very happy to be seeing it physically. This is the book that Aili is going to be talking about. So who is Aili Tripp? Aili Tripp is a professor, a research professor of political science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She has done research for over 4 decades on gender, women and politics, women's movement in Africa, transnational feminism, and authoritarian politics in Africa. She has a PhD in political science from Northwestern University in the USA. She's a publisher of so many books, and she has been modest and didn't want me to read the books, but I said, this is how we celebrate ourselves. So I'm going to read some of the books that she has published, because we have online some of the students, our master's and PhD students, and they may be interested in some of the titles. She's the author of Seeking Legitimacy: Why Arab Autocracies Adapt Women's Rights. This is where I need my glasses. Women and Power in Post-Conflict Africa. Museveni's Uganda: Paradoxes of Power in a Hybrid Regime. African Women's Movements Transforming Political Landscapes. Women and Politics in Uganda. And Changing the Rules, the Politics of Liberalization and the Urban Informal Economy in Tanzania. She also co-published several others, but there's one that I reminded her, my first novice publication was in the women's movement in Uganda. It wasn't here. So
and Peace Musimiento also.
Peace Musimiento was there. So when we had just finished our masters, we were asked to submit manuscripts, and she was our first editor, so we are so proud to have you here, and we're very happy that you've always kept in touch and come back to share with us your wealth of knowledge in this area. Professor Aili Tripp she has been the president of African Studies Association, and this is very good for students who are intending to grow in the academia. Subscribe to African Studies Association and go and make your presentation there. And she has been the vice president of the American Political Science Association. She currently serves as a series editor of a University of Wisconsin book series, Women and Gender in Africa, with another editor. I was privileged to do my PhD in University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she was a professor. So I'm very happy, and I'm thinking that there could be some members of University of Wisconsin online as well. Professor Aili Tripp, we are very privileged to have you talk about this book with us, go through what you've written, and we are all ears to listen to your presentation. You're welcome.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. It's really a great honor to be here today. I'm very grateful to the the Gender Studies, Gender Women's Studies Department or faculty, and especially to Florence Ebila and Eamon Mwine and Josephine Ahikira and all the people who helped make this event happen. So thank you very much. There's a conundrum in many authoritarian countries today when it comes to women's leadership, namely their success in attaining leadership roles. Can you hear?
Just a minute. I'm being told to ask the online audience. Can you hear as well?
Today when it comes to women's leadership, namely that their success in gaining these roles has paradoxically ended up strengthening the very regime that violates human rights and women's rights in other ways. And this creates a kind of paradox that's not easily resolved. On the one hand, it makes sense for women's rights activists to demand power, because with power you're better able to, in better position to influence women's rights and democratic reforms. On the other hand, the inclusion of women can also simultaneously strengthen the longevity and entrenchment of the regime. And although it can contribute to the longevity of democracies at the same time, it doesn't have the same consequences for women. And it's this tension that I'm trying to grapple with in this book project. So in other words, I'm looking at the objectives of women's movements and those advocating for women's leadership, but at the same time, the ways in which the states themselves instrumentalize and use women leaders for their own purposes. And so that's the tension that I'm interested in. So in today's talk, I'll give a little background to the project. I'll talk about some of the existing literature on women in authoritarian contexts. I'll talk about the research questions that motivated this book. I'll talk a bit about my research design and methods, and then how authoritarian regimes came to instrumentalize women leaders. So first, just to give an overall sense of the lay of the land, I'm a political scientist, so I look at things from that perspective. And what we've seen overall in Africa is a real change in the face of African politics. You have 3 times more women in parliament, for example, than you did in 1995. And much of this has been driven by the use of gender quotas. We also have women speakers of the House in about 1/3 of African parliaments, and that's higher than the world average of 20%. There are 3 times more women ministers than what we saw in 1995. There's also been more women running for president. More women heading up political parties. So basically more women in local government and so on. So on every front we're seeing fairly major changes. And the increase in women's representation in parliaments has really jumped, especially after 1995. And that was the year when there was a conference held in Beijing, UN Conference on Women. And after that, a platform of action was adopted that required that member states of the UN take some action to increase women's representation. And so in many countries, I mean, not Uganda, Uganda already had quotas in '89, but many other countries around the world began to adopt gender quotas, and that then is why we begin to see that increase. But also in Africa, we began to see that increase in many parts of Africa. And it happened at the same time that democratization efforts increased in Africa, especially after 1990, but then they've subsequently plateaued, and now with the increase of all these coups d'etat in West Africa, 9 countries have had successful coups and 9 have had unsuccessful ones. We've seen now a decrease in democracy overall in Africa. But the big change here is this use of gender quotas, and that's especially in legislatures. Prior to 1995, only 7 countries in Africa had gender quotas, and today it's around 84%. So much of the literature, I mean, there's very little literature in general, not just in Africa but globally, on authoritarianism and women's rights. It's a new area that's gaining in interest. And much of the literature treats women's representation in politics as a net good. They don't really differentiate it. They don't really even reference regime type. It's just that, oh, this is wonderful, women are getting into politics, isn't that great? And then there's another literature out there that says, well, in authoritarian countries, everything that happens, it's all negative for women. There's nothing positive happening. Women's equality is being rolled back in at the same time that authoritarianism is on the rise. And certainly, coming from the U.S., I teach in a U.S. institution. We feel that very strongly in the U.S. that as things have become more authoritarian, women's rights are being pulled back, and we're losing abortion rights, and we're losing on a lot of fronts. So there's that sentiment that's out there. But the thing is that this is being generalized to the whole world and to all time and all place. And then there's another literature that's fairly new that talks about authoritarian regimes using women as a form of gender washing, that they're weaponizing women's rights in a variety of ways. And so this is another branch of the literature, and I do build on where I have been part of that trend. But I have other points that I also want to make, and you'll hear them today. So maybe I'll just say a few more things. That I think that there's, some of the limitations of this literature are that, for example, when it comes to at least the claim that Chenoweth and Marx make, that gender equality is being rolled back at the same time as authoritarianism is growing. I think that it's true, and I have evidence that it's true for certain areas, especially reproductive rights and around LGBTQ rights. That's where we see this kind of rollback. Certainly there are countries like Russia and China and Iran, Afghanistan that have adopted visibly aggressive policies that undermine women's status. In Afghanistan, one could call it, full-blown gender apartheid. But then you also have other countries like the United Arab Emirates, which are actively seeking to, this is their language, they say they want to become the shining example to the rest of the world in terms of gender equality. And as you know, UAE is a monarchy, it's very authoritarian, there's no elections even at the national level. And yet you have 50% of the parliamentarians are women, 30% of the cabinet positions are women. They're promoting women in education, in the STEM fields. Women are now becoming astronauts. They're race car drivers. They're doing all kinds of things that they hadn't done before in UAE. And so we have to somehow make sense of this. This is, these are many of the changes that are taking place are not just gender washing and not just simply a figment of someone's imagination. There's a certain reality to it. And so I think that there's a place for understanding that this gender washing is taking place and women's rights are being instrumentalized. I'm making a strong case for that. But there's a certain reality to it. And you see this quite clearly when you look at then, which I do in one of the chapters in the book, at the end, I think it's the 10th chapter, I go into how does women's leadership translate into other areas of gender equality, other measures. And
low pressure required to sustain offensive operations. Armored vehicle.
Okay. And so when it comes to, for example, legislative representation, if you look at the numbers, there's almost no difference between authoritarian and countries and democracies when it comes to legislative representation or the adoption of quotas. If you look at the number of constitutional reforms, there's actually a slight authoritarian countries have a slight advantage, but basically it's about the same. Same thing when it comes to levels of education, women at all levels of education, health measures, maternal mortality, for example. Economic empowerment, entrepreneurship, you see very little difference in Africa between authoritarian and democratic countries. When it comes to some other areas, you do see some differences. And so cabinet representation in Africa, as well as the rest of the world, you see democracies doing slightly better than autocracies. When it comes to reproductive rights, like I said, LGBTQ rights, marriage rights, the age of marriage, for example, those the democracies do slightly better. But the main difference between autocracies and democracies is really in the area of political rights and civil liberties, and that's where you see the big difference. And that's speaks to the extent to which women's movements can operate. It speaks to the extent to which the opposition, women in the opposition, have room to maneuver and room for leadership. So in that sense, that's extremely important. But overall, on a very large number of measures, there really isn't that much difference. One finding that's out there in the literature is that party-based authoritarian regimes are much more important for promoting women's leaders than personal-based regimes. In other words, military dictatorships don't do very well. Monarchies don't do very well. But regimes that have a party base to them, they tend to do much better. So Chama Cha Mapinduzi in Tanzania, Frelimo in Mozambique, and so on. Also, the degree of party institutionalization is key. There's a literature on that, although I'm going to argue that, in fact, what's more important in Africa is the entrenchment of parties. How long have they been in power? And then also the changes in international norms, which I alluded to, talking about the UN conference in Beijing and how impactful that was in terms of increasing women's representation. So there's a literature on all of these aspects. And here you can see just a chart. I looked for Africa. I took kind of the general premise that and the coding that has been used by Getty's, Wright, and France, and and applied it to the African cases, and you can see that over time the party-based regimes have done much better than those that have been military regimes, which don't really care very much about women usually. They're not just because they're patriarchal, but because they, they're too busy warding off coup d'état and they're not engaged in legislative activities and so on for the most part. I mean, there are a few exceptions, like Thomas Sankara, who did do quite a bit for women in Burkina Faso. But other than that, it's for the most part that generalization holds true. And then monarchies, which there again are not many, but Morocco, for example. So you can see that the trends over time with these different types of regimes. So for this project, I looked at several cases. I'm doing historical process tracing here. So I looked at 3 authoritarian countries, so Uganda, Rwanda, and Zimbabwe, and then 2 semi-authoritarian countries, Morocco and Mauritania, and then 2 democracies, Namibia and Botswana. And with these countries, you get, some of them have I've lost track of where I'm here. Some of them have, you have different parts of Africa here represented. You have different colonial histories, so Morocco, Mauritania, former French colonies, Uganda, former British, Rwanda, former Belgian, Namibia, and Namibia had been under South African rule for a long time, but before that, German rule. Zimbabwe British, Botswana British. So you have different colonial histories represented here, and different regional representation. Okay. Oh, I was going to say also that Mauritania and Morocco are primarily Muslim, so you also get that, and then the rest of them are primarily Christian. So again, you have that variance. And some of them have, I didn't select them for this reason, but some have active women's movements as well, like Zimbabwe has an active women's movement. Others have less, so Botswana has hardly any kind of mobilization going on. And Mauritania is fairly recent. In terms of methods, this book was researched during COVID, which is when I had time off, and so I couldn't travel, and so I was forced to use, do the interviews over WhatsApp and Zoom, and so it was. I don't know why this is moving. A little bit strange here. Sorry, it wants to, I really don't know what's going on there, but anyway, some kind of magic happening. Is it COVID? It reacted. Anyway, most of my work for that, like I've been working in Africa for my whole life, and I mean my whole career, and so I've done mostly interviews face to face, and I've done surveys, and I've done archival work, and done other kinds of work. But in this case, I did these interviews over Zoom, so it wasn't ideal. So I had to enlist the help of people like Tendo Namata here, who's sitting here, who is working in gender studies, and other people to help me identify and make contacts during this kind of difficult time, COVID. And so I engage in process tracing and do some comparative analysis in this book. And the questions that motivated the project were, why do autocracies instrumentalize women's rights? Why do they even bother with women's rights? I mean, they could just ignore them if they don't have to engage with them. There often aren't huge electoral pressures to promote women, so why do they do that? And then how did authoritarian countries come to promote women as leaders? How did that evolve? And then what are the consequences of the inclusion of women in politics? And what are the consequences when women are instrumentalized and used to enhance the legitimacy of an autocratic regime and enhance its longevity? So one of the arguments that I make in the book is that one of the reasons why autocrats, there's many reasons, but one of them is that they want to use women as leaders to entrench themselves and stay in power, to further entrench themselves. And in Africa, one of the features that you see is that a large number of countries have this kind of a hegemonic executive rule, and so you have a ruling party that's surrounded by some smaller, very unstable parties that come and go, but you have this one party that stays in power. And so Giovanni Sartori talked about this kind of a system where you have this dominant one-party system where you have a party that's been in power for more than 3 consecutive electoral wins. And I'm calling that an entrenched party, a party that's, where you have this dominant one-party system, but then they become entrenched. And so you see this pattern, the countries that have done the best for women in terms of women in politics, Rwanda, Uganda, so RPF in Uganda, in Rwanda, NRM in Uganda, Chama cha Mapinduzi in Tanzania, Frelimo in Mozambique, ANC in South Africa, SWAPO in Namibia. These parties have been there for a long time, and you have this dynamic where women are, if they want to win, it's the party to go with because they're going to win at the end of the day. But also parties have been able to use, in particular, used reserved seats to be able to maintain their power, and it gives them a certain amount of legitimacy. So it's a kind of a two-way street that's at play. Then, in democracies where you would have higher levels of competition, then you can also have higher levels of representation. So the more competitive the system, the better. So like I said, the competition works very, very differently. It works for democracies and it works against autocracies in terms of women's representation. When you look then at this issue of entrenchment, you can see the pattern here quite clearly. It doesn't really matter what level of government. If you look at the legislature, you look at local government, look at ministers, all of those parties that are in Africa that have these ruling entrenched parties tend to do better than the countries where they don't have entrenched parties, where parties alternate, like in Ghana or Nigeria or Kenya. So one of the challenges in looking at this whole issue of instrumentalization of women leaders was that there's many things going on, and there isn't really one story. In Africa, we're talking about 53 countries here, and so there's a lot of variation, and not just in Africa, but also globally. But there are a number of different, kind of patterns that we see. And so, for example, you can see that there's an economic dimension that also has an international element to it, and that is that there's an effort to kind of use the image of women as leaders as a way of signaling to foreign investors. This you don't see it's not common in Africa. You see it in countries like Morocco, which their main trade partners are Spain and France, and also the EU countries. And there's been much more pressure from the EU countries and from France and Spain to increase women's representation and to fund various initiatives to increase representation, along with other kinds of reforms. So that's where you see foreign direct investment kind of playing a role. But for most of Africa, the main trade partners are China and UAE, India, and other African countries, and so there hasn't been that same kind of urgency or interest in that dimension. Other kind of strategies are not so much. I wouldn't say that these would be these other economic strategies that are more nationally oriented. They are not directly tied to the representation of women, but they show how the representation of women is part of a broader strategy. Very often this economic strategy is the most important one. Outside of Africa, for example, if you want to understand what's happening right now in the Gulf countries, in the Arabian Peninsula, in the oil-producing countries, UAE and Saudi Arabia, they're one of the fastest growing countries in terms of promoting women's labor force participation. I mean, it's just, of course, their baseline was very low, but they've just taken off. And part of that is because they feel the need to diversify their economy and move away from an oil-based economy into other sectors. And women are essential, and they're part of that scenario. And so that's where you're also seeing, like in UAE, also increasing women in politics as a way of signaling that they're promoting women, and they want to become the shining example to the rest of the world of their of gender equality. In Rwanda, it's the expanding export-oriented agriculture that's been very important. Then on the kind of political, I can't go through all of the factors, but just to highlight a few, in the political on the political side of things, internationally, many countries like Morocco, for example, Morocco and Tunisia had the highest number of fighters with Daesh or with ISIS, and so they felt the necessity to kind of offset that image of their countries being these jihadist hotbeds of jihadism, and so they used women's rights as a way of driving a wedge with the Salafists and trying to isolate them. So there was that aspect. But also, after civil war, after military rule, in the case of Mauritania, and I'll talk a bit more about Mauritania, it's a way of improving your image here of the country internationally. Also, in the case of Rwanda, and I'll talk a bit more about that, but also it's a way of seeking legitimacy against a very poor human rights record. Many countries, they pay, in fact, I talked to a lot of ministers of gender in various countries, and they all said that they pay attention to these international indices that track how well women are represented in the Interparliamentary Union, for example, keeps track, and there's many other indices. Also to assert global or regional leadership. The Southern African Development Community has put a lot of pressure on their member states, 14 member states, to increase women's representation. And so that's another way of signaling adoption of quotas, promoting women leaders. But then there's a national element to this also. So part of it's then women are promoted to expand the vote share of the ruling party, which is what I think part of what's happening in Uganda. Expand patronage linkages with new groups of people. Respond to women's movement pressures, a very important element to all of this. The women's coalitions have been very critical in promoting, for example, the use of adoption of gender quotas in a country like Senegal, for example. And then in the more left-leaning socialist countries, the adherence to egalitarian principles, ideological principles, have been very important. In the case of Frelimo, for example. So you can see that there's a lot of different things going on, and a lot of different reasons to instrumentalize women as leaders. So how did this come about? What patterns do we see in Africa? Well, one of them is that a lot of the push came after the shift from one-party to multi-party rule in the 1990s. And I'll elaborate on this a bit more. But this was when you had, countries opened up political space. It wasn't always a tremendous amount, but it was more than there had been before. And this then allowed for the emergence of autonomous women's organizations, and that then pushed for women's leadership, among other issues. I mean, we moved from a situation where you had women's organizations that were tied to the ruling party, that then became, and then you had the emergence of all kinds of organizations involved in environmental issues, land rights, women in politics, and entrepreneurship, professional associations, all kinds of associations emerged. They had their own leaders. The leaders were no longer just simply the sisters and wives of the ruling party. They were independent now. And then you had also the funding also often came from abroad, and so they had independent sources of income. They didn't need to rely on the ruling party for their funding. So that then was one piece of the story in terms of how you began to see the expansion of women's leadership after the 1990s. Then you also saw this pattern in post-conflict countries. So when I first started working on women in politics in Africa, I looked around, looked at the continent and looked to see what was going on. And the country where that was most advanced was Uganda in the early 1990s, because you had women in the cabinet here, and you had a high level, they had adopted gender quotas, so you had a fairly high, at the time, fairly high level of representation in the national parliament. And they had the local council representation of women. And so I was like, okay, well, what's going on there? What I couldn't see then, but what then became much clearer later on, especially after 2000, you could see the pattern that the countries that came out of conflict had much, much higher levels of representation than countries that didn't go through conflict. And then we'd come back to our changing international norms, which were around women's representation and that whole dimension. So, so here you have this democratization and this political opening that I just mentioned, and the shift from one party to multi-party states. I mean, it didn't mean only a few countries truly became democratic, but many countries, they did open up a little bit of political space, and then many of them became, they kind of went back and forth between some, aspects of democratization, but then shifting back to, autocratization and mixing the two. But one of the main motivations, and this is something that you'll see globally, is, and I don't think anyone's really pointed this out, but that most of all the countries except for just one or two, Guyana and Samoa, all the countries globally that adopt reserved seats, that is where they set a certain number of seats aside just for women, all of them are authoritarian. And in Africa, it's the same situation. They're all authoritarian. The ones that adopt a specific kind of a gender quota. There are other kinds of gender quotas, such as voluntary party quotas. These are quotas that where the parties themselves decide they're going to put a certain number. They're going to run a certain number of women candidates. So Frelimo has that system. SWAPO in Namibia has that system. ANC in South Africa. So that's another kind of a gender quota. And then a third kind of quota are the most common, or actually these are all equally common in Africa, are the legislative quotas. And that's where you have, the legislature says that all parties have to adopt some kind of a system that gives some kind of preferential treatment to women. So they alternate then between, say in a zebra party list, they'll alternate man, woman, man, woman, man, woman on the party list. And then that would then allow 50%, or a little, depending on who's at the top of the party list, it will then allow roughly around 50% representation for both genders. So I think this is what we're seeing in Uganda. I mean, there's many reasons in Uganda also why why women have been promoted, but one of them is this, this ability to control the women who are in these reserved seats. It's a kind of low-cost strategy that gives you this ready-made constituency that you can control, it's easier to control the women that are in those seats. Uganda is, like I said, a case that is a post-conflict, one of the post-conflict cases that I've looked at. Museveni came into power in 1986, as you know. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. But I believe that this national resistance movement then became one of these entrenched parties. And that's what's given, it's had this longevity. It's used women to maintain legitimacy, to continue, but it's also, at the same time, women have associated themselves with the NRM because they know that that's going to be the easiest way that they're going to win if they want to run for office. And many women also have used the NRM for their own purposes, for their own power, for their own interests. So then Uganda, unlike many of the countries I was describing, it became multi-party much later than many of the other African countries, but it did go that route in 2005. And it has experienced pressure from women's movement and from women leaders to promote women's representation in parliament and other bodies. So as a result, and again, these are numbers I'm sure you're familiar with, but you have it's not the highest, but you have relatively high levels. We're talking now compared to other countries in Africa, relatively high levels of representation in local government, in parliament, 1/3, cabinet 43%, Supreme Court justices are almost half, 5 out of 11. You've had 2 women speakers of the House. You've had 2 vice presidents, which is, again, much higher than most African countries. I don't think it's an accident that you saw all of a sudden a lot of women in power, especially after the last election, 2021, not 2026, but 2021, which was a very, very, violent, very much repression in that election. And then all of a sudden, you have woman vice president, woman prime minister, another Supreme Court justice. You have the deputy prime minister, a woman, Anita Among, became the Speaker of the House. The government chief whip in Parliament. So you have a lot of women appointments that were made at that time, and I think it was in part. I don't think this was the only reason. There were many other reasons, but in part it was to kind of do what Kagame has done in Rwanda and say, don't look over here at our repression, but look over here. We're promoting women's rights and we're promoting women as leaders. Kind of put a gloss on it. And part of what's at work play here, and again, like I said, it's not the only thing that's happening here, but part of it has been this interest in promoting vote share, because after it went multi-party, then all of a sudden, like in other African countries, it became you could no longer get the 99%, 100% victory. So all of a sudden, you had to figure out how to do that, because you then had to deal with the lower vote share. And again, I fully understand that these numbers are not, we can challenge them, but just to give a sense of give you a sense of the, the pattern, the problem that the NRM had to deal with. And so then you see this increase in women's representation that takes place then from the earlier years, like say, right after the NRM took over with 18%, then goes up to what today is 32%. So it's increased. And they've done that by, through the use of these reserve seats, which the numbers keep going up because the districts keep getting increased, but also through the numbers of women in open seats who tend to be NRM women, even if they're running as independents. And then you have the women at the appointments. And so overall, the women the NRM women have done very well in the parliament. But there are other ways in which women have been, I wanted to say one more thing about the numbers of women here. It's not just that NRM women have done well, it's also that opposition women have done disproportionately worse than NRM women, and also disproportionately worse than male opposition leaders. So that's another piece of this, that NRM women and independents have 2 times better chance than opposition women. So it's a losing proposition for women in the opposition. And women in the opposition have also faced other kinds of repression. They've been picked off as leaders by the NRM. They've been decampaigned very aggressively, and they've also faced repression, very physical repression. 30%. So women in local government, 30, women in parliament, 23%, cabinet, 1/3. You have women mayors. Mayor of Nouakchott, the capital, is a woman. The first Arab woman foreign minister was from Mauritania. So all of a sudden you have this kind of proliferation of women. And again, these numbers may not seem impressive, but compared to what they had before, these are huge jumps. And again, a lot of this it dates back to the time when they stopped having the coup d'etats and having military rule. I should mention that Mauritania is a country where women are very highly valued. They have what I call a matriculture. They are very women-focused in their orientation, and even historically, if you go back to even the 11th century, they had women leaders. Ibn Battuta, who was a geographer from northern Morocco, wrote about running into women leaders in Mauritania, and was quite shocked and stunned that this could be, but they have this very long history of women's leadership. So it's not a culture that's against women as leaders, but I think it's because of the military rule that made it just so difficult for them to emerge in those positions. And one of the points that people made over and over again in the interviews was that women, when they've come into the parliament, they're not simply just tokens. They're playing positive roles. So, for example, and these are just typical quotes from the interviews, but women's rights activists said that today women in parliament are more combative than men, they have more ideas, they are more responsible in their struggle than many men, they animate the Mauritanian parliament a lot. They've taken their courage in their own hands to fight injustice and mismanagement. And by injustice, they are referring to slavery. So slavery is illegal in Mauritania, but it's still practiced. And so women have been really at the forefront of the movement against slavery. Then another male NGO leader said, women in parliament are the best deputies here. And he gave many examples. And then he said, all these women have made their mark in parliament. So every time we give more to women, our political situation improves. They defend all cases, especially those of the most disadvantaged and victims of injustice. So again, you have the injustice, the slavery term there. Okay, so then we have this a second reason, and that is, we talked about the move towards multipartyism and the opening of political space, but the second reason is this jump in legislative representation in post-conflict countries. And so you can see here the blue line are the countries that are that have had major conflict, and then the red line are those that have had no conflict. So again, this is legislative representation of women. You can see that there's a difference between the two over time, and it increases over time as well. And so I wrote a book here in 2015 where I looked at this phenomena of this post-conflict phenomena. And I looked at, Uganda was one of the cases, but I also looked at Liberia and Angola. And so the explanation for this there's, again, in post-conflict countries, there's many different factors that one can look at. But one is that you tend to have a situation where you have new people coming into power. Now we're talking major conflict. We're not talking coup d'etat. We're not talking rebellion in Casamance or northern Uganda, or some smaller rebellion that's a part of the country. I'm talking about consequential conflict that actually requires a new constitution. New people come into power. And they need new constituencies of new power bases, and so women are ready-made power base, 51% of the population. So, why not take advantage of that? And so this, and when you are writing a new constitution, it's much easier to introduce something like women's rights and quotas and so on in that kind of a situation than if you are reforming a constitution. That's much, much harder to do. And so that's why those moments are really key, and especially if there's an active women's movement, it's really, it allows then for women's movements to put pressure and actually make some gains. So Rwanda is kind of the iconic case like this. Rwanda has the highest level of representation of women in the world at 63%. And again, I don't think it's an accident that it happened after the genocide. They went from, I think, initially 17% before the genocide in '94 to about 43% right after the genocide, and then it just kept going up from then on. And it wasn't just, having a new constitution, but it's also then what follows from it. So you have electoral reforms that take place after that have to, to respond to the new constitution. You also have earlier on, maybe in other countries, peace accords. That wasn't the case in Rwanda, but many countries that's the case. And so you have these, other kinds of opportunity structures that emerge. And so Rwanda then has done something that again, I don't see a lot of in Africa, but it's there to some degree everywhere, a little bit. But Rwanda really has taken it to another level, and that is this issue of virtue signaling that they use. If you go to Rwanda, you'll see there's all kinds of conferences held by the Inter-Parliamentary Union and many, many different organizations that have their conferences there on women's leadership. And Kagame has kind of milked it to the max in terms of, this kind of using women as to do the status signaling. They also make strategic appointments of their female ambassadors. So they put, female ambassadors to Sweden and to, the Nordic countries. And so, it's again a way of, to the countries that care about these things, it's a way of signaling to them, look, we've got women in these positions. But it's also a way of diverting attention from human rights abuses. So Rwanda is a difficult country in terms. It's done very well on the economic front and many fronts. But one of the issues has really been the politicization of ethnicity in a different way now under the RPF than what it had been before. But it's nevertheless continuing. And so if you are in the opposition and you challenge the government, you can be put in prison very easily. And this, in fact, happened to one of the people that I interviewed for the book, not because of the book, but, before. She was the head of the main coalition of opposition parties, and she had said that, during the genocide, there were also people, Hutus, who were also killed because they had, they were against the genocide and they had been killed as well. And then next thing she knows, she's being accused of being a genocidaire and promoting, genocide, which was about as far from the truth as could be. But anyway, it cost her, and now she'd been already in solitary confinement for 5 years, and she had been sentenced to 15, and then got out, and now she's again in prison or under house arrest. So, you can see if it's a difficult road, as long as you support the government, you're fine. If you don't, and if you're in the opposition, and if you're an opposition woman, you're in trouble. And she's not the only one. There's been several women who run for president, and all of them have ended up in trouble, or their families have ended up in trouble. And then finally, you have these international pressures. The UN pressure from the UN women, pressure from the UN conferences that have had important consequences for women's representation. And so one example, one of my cases is Morocco, which I actually also included in another book that I did on seeking legitimacy, why the Maghreb countries have promoted women leaders. But in this book, I look at it from a different angle. I look more at the international aspect because it is quite different. And so here you've seen this gradual increase of women parliamentarians. also women in about over 1/3 of the seats in local council, 7 out of 24 cabinet ministers, 13 out of 64 women ambassadors. So that's the highest in the MENA region in terms of women's ambassadors. And then all the 3 largest cities, Rabat, Marrakesh, and Casablanca, all have women mayors. And this says that women are the Maghrebian women are the Fahal Watan, which is the treasure of the nation. It's a newspaper article. So in Moroccan case, the motivation, I think, is some of it. It's not, again, only part of it, is the interest in courting the European Union. This is not to say they don't have a lot of problems with the French and with this and with the EU, but they also are. It's their major trade partner, both in terms of exports and imports. And the EU is the biggest foreign investor in Morocco. So part of this is, creating a certain image and using women to create that image of a modern, progressive, forward-looking Morocco. But, this brings us to the kind of big question that I end with, and that is, what does this inclusion of women actually mean? And that's something that I'm sure many of you have a lot of thoughts about. And so I can point to one of the quotes from Miriam Matembe, who said that Museveni intended to offer women an opportunity to get into political structures, and his policies were supposed to motivate them and bring them on board so that their views could be heard and that they would be able to influence the governance agenda. But as I talk now, the affirmative action, as you know, it's a double-edged sword. It can be used by those in power to sustain them in power. So, again, what does it mean? It also can mean when systems instrumentalize women leaders, it means that they can also end up strengthening the very regimes that violate human rights and that violate women's rights. And this kind of creates a conundrum that's not easily resolved. On the one hand, it makes perfect sense for women's rights activists to demand representation and demand power, because with power you're able to in a better position to influence women's rights and democratic reforms. But at the same time, you risk being co-opted. You risk providing legitimacy to a regime that's inherently problematic from a human rights perspective. A regime that seeks absolute dominance over its adversaries. In many countries we've seen, and in the book I kind of document all of this, that women's rights often get subordinated to other priorities, and especially when it comes to funding. Or they can be, there can be a quick turnaround. Sometimes, in the case of Algeria, they had the quota, and then they went up to 30% women in parliament almost overnight. And then all of a sudden they went from 6% to 31%, and then they took the quota away, and then it went down to 8%, just like that. I mean, and they can do that. I mean, there's nothing to stop them. There's no pressure to stop them. There's also, the demands often don't go far enough. If the policy is adopted, it can backslide, or maybe it's not implemented, or the agency that's supposed to implement it isn't created. Very often there aren't the resources or the political will to enforce the policy, so you have all these nice laws on the books, but it's just, it's just paper. And then you have this co-optation of women into a very undemocratic system, partly because there just isn't any choice. So one of the questions that I kept asking over and over again in these various countries that I did the interviews in was, why do women, under these circumstances, when it is so difficult, Zimbabwe is a country where women just have there's such an active women's movement, but they're just constantly getting clobbered. And I asked this question especially there because it just seemed like it was such a, fruitless pursuit. But honestly, not everybody, but most people were pretty dead set on continuing the fight for women's advancement. They didn't see, they understood the challenge much better than I did. They said, we are gradually educating, we are gradually raising awareness. This is one woman I interviewed. who was an activist. She said, we are gradually influencing change. We are aware that we're not going to have the impact with the results that we want overnight. And so I do the work that I do today because of what my mom went through. There's a whole revolution that's been happening from the time of independence in my own personal space, and I can see the difference and I can see the impact. I'm doing the stuff that my mother and grandmother would never have dreamed of doing. And so that's where I leave you. And I really welcome your feedback and would love to hear what you think about all of this. Thank you very much. We continue to share, right?
For inviting Aili. She's a professor, but for us we call her Aili. Because this trip thing means that you have now gone away. Thank you, Chair. So first, I would like to applaud Aili on this very groundbreaking book. I could categorize it, in my view, as profoundly as feminist comparative politics. And Trip, now I've changed, has been a front runner really in this comparative venture when we think about African feminist scholarship. She's been at the forefront of academic mentoring. Ebila has talked about that, and joining colleagues to co-edit books on women's leadership, on the women's movement, and editing books in which several scholars have been enabled to publish and expand voice on these things. And one could say really that, as they say, brother's keeper, I'm going to say sister's keeper, within feminist scholarship, Aili has been a sister's keeper. But much more importantly, if I could say, the value of comparative politics, comparative inquiry. As most of us know, when we start writing, case of Uganda, case of my sub-county, case of my district, not bad at all, but comparative politics, comparative inquiry, now traversing the entire continent and going beyond and going to Asia, the Arab world and so on. It gives you a broader picture of things, going beyond stereotypes and simplistic analysis, and it sort of challenges us to pose more questions and engaging, deepening engagement. In this very venture, this is where problems start becoming very apparent. I struggled with this book. It has a lot of information. It uses large data sets. And while many of you are sleeping during COVID, eating and thinking that Museveni is the one making you, what is this thing called? Lockdown. Some other people are looking at large data sets. For me, I was so challenged, and that the way in which the broad kind of brush on in terms of understanding this very, I think it's a paradox. And the way you approach a paradox can also be a paradox in its own, because I think, Trip, you approached a paradox by asking many questions. And so, as a reader, sometimes you say, okay, what is this that is being talked about? But definitely, this book, I have a copy, so you can envy me from now, but we are going to share the soft copy. I've been looking at gender and politics in Uganda sometimes attempting comparison, but I have never done this kind of work. So I'm learning in terms of how to actually do comparative inquiry, so that you understand, for example, what is happening, why are things happening the way they are, in situations sometimes where you would expect different outcomes. And then looking, for example, what's the difference between Morocco and Namibia? What's the difference between Mauritania and Uganda or Rwanda? I felt cheated that the democracies used were only those two frontline sort of unique states, Namibia and Botswana. Wish we could have had a little bit more, let's say, from South Africa and maybe some other countries, Ghana, in the middle there, in terms of understanding what is it that is at stake, and really the nature of political power and how it animates some of the outcomes. So, as I've said, African feminism is in dire need of comparative inquiry, and this book on why African autocracies promote women as leaders is a great resource. And I liked the question that is raised in the foreword that you were asked at the start. What is there to discuss when it comes to women's rights in authoritarian countries, since by definition, these regimes are hostile to women's rights? What would be there to discuss? These autocracies, there's authoritarianism, there's concentration of power, personalized power. What is there to discuss? And when I saw this, I actually, laughed aloud, and because it sounded so real, and that one should not even waste valuable ink to pen down this. And so I quote the one prominent European scholar who said, yeah, what is there to discuss? This is a waste of time during a seminar. So, but there is something to discuss, and that's what you're telling us, and a little bit more in terms of what we want to understand. I'm going to raise around 4 questions, which for me sort of even go to make the situation even more dire. So as I read on, I kept on shifting grounds and so on. First and foremost, the fact that autocrats instrumentalize women leaders, that statement alone, for me, if I'm to analyze political power and so on, I find that it may not just be instrumentalization, but rather it's an interesting intersection, because most of these countries are also post-conflict. And for those who have studied post-conflict situations, they find that it's not just about the leaders using women, but that the conflict and the tensions and the activism that come out of those tensions, women are part and parcel of that population in which those tensions are being resolved. So they are not participating, they are not helping, but they are part and parcel. So, for example, in the case of Uganda, women were part and parcel of the tension within the guerrilla movement. They participated, they did not help, although the leaders take this as their project. They personalize the project, but actually that was a national project, which is otherwise captured. So once it's captured, then it looks like it's a male masculine project, but really it's a societal national project. And so in that post-conflict reconstruction, you find that there is that imperative to address whatever issues are resident in that community. And one of those really was the absence of women in leadership. It was so apparent. And so at the beginning, really, if you look at how, for example, the NRA and the the resistance councils evolved, it was not a leader giving, but rather these voices coming into play. And they come into play until around the 2000s, when the regime begins to want to consolidate and stay in power. So the situation now changes, and the leaders now become part and parcel of they personalize that project, and therefore they start giving handouts. But otherwise, when you look at the genesis, even of the reserved seats, it was a struggle. Only that there was resistance to redistribute power in elective politics. So you see that actually they are not actually reserved, they are add-on seats. Because the struggle, if you look at the Matembes and all that, they were looking for representation. And the give and take within the post-conflict negotiation and political settlement is those add-on seats is what comes out. And now those seats become apparent in ways in which when there is voting and so on. But I could say that the entire population is under capture. It's only just women. The entire population, the youth, the people with disabilities, the workers. By the way, the women, you could say they still have a voice. The labor movement has completely eclipsed. They are died. They are dead. They only come out when they want to elect leaders to parliament. You never know how that constituency comes about. And the women's movement could be almost the only social movement that still has a voice. And the intersection with the needs of the regime is an interesting kind of paradox that you've helped us to try to ask questions about. And for me, the question therefore, when you say that the main problem with the way authoritarians instrumentalize women's rights is not that they are trying to deceive others with their gender policies. Instead, it has to do with the need for authoritarian regimes to repress the opposition and suppress civil liberties and political rights, using women and women's rights to legitimize and entrench a regime that does this. I really had a problem with this. I could agree up to a certain point, and then I say, one, it's like we are saying that autocracies, and actually you say that autocracies that have remained in power for decades are more likely to advance women as leaders. This proposition is really troubling. And I said, one, it accords so much power to women. I wish it was so, by the way, Because I said, okay, if it was this, then women's rights would have become an election matter. It doesn't. Having women in key positions, yes, it looks like, in my understanding, that there are new players on the block. Because when you look, for example, at the ruling parties, they've had men in their network, in their social network, in their informal networks, and sometimes those informal networks hit a snag. And the rulers, the ruling elite, bring in new players, not that these new players are going to suppress the other ones, but that the new players are not able to actually play the game of informal networks. And that you can see in most of the ruling parties. Now, the second issue that I wanted to raise is the slippery ground, women as leaders, female representation, legislative representation, women's rights, gender reforms. These terms sometimes are used interchangeably in the book, and yet, one can say that there's a difference. For example, women as leaders, which is the title of the book, is different from female representation, and it's different from women's rights and gender reforms. Why? Because you may have, as you have correctly argued in this book and other, you may have descriptive representation, meaning that you have women there, but they don't necessarily represent the women's rights lobby, or do not even participate in pushing for gender reforms. This international animal. So I remember even Tamale in 1999 argued around this in terms of the international image. And I said, let's get this international animal out of the way. In a sense that more women's representation in public politics is used as a red herring, so that the international community does not see the repression of other of civil liberties and so on. But I ask, couldn't we actually look at this substantively as coloniality? Why would the so-called international community be easily deceived by window dressing? If people deceive you by putting things in the window, but you have the capacity to enter the shop, why would you accept to be deceived? That is one. But two, isn't international another sanitized term for former colonial powers? Could we really come out and interrogate the coloniality and post-coloniality within authoritarianism versus women as leaders? I think it would add a little bit more in terms of disentangling the paradox. And for me, I always ask, who is international? Some of you who are discussing the sovereignty bill, be careful. You're going to Canada. You're going to be international, right? Or foreigner. So anyway, what is international in this international pressure? Can we also try to interrogate it, because you find that all this repression is on top. It's visible. It's current. It's on televisions. It's on radio. It's on print media. It doesn't need to be window dressed with women leaders. Why would that kind of international community be diverted, easily diverted like that? And the blind eye sometimes that they turn on contradictions in internal democratization processes in sort of just look at superficial things. I think that's something that we need to interrogate. The third issue that I would want to put is the fact that even when we talk about women's rights, they are diverse. When we talk about even these autocracies, as it has been beautifully done in this book, they are diverse. So in some cases, you have autocracies where the dominant leader with highly personalized power can make certain key decisions that could otherwise not be made in a competitive, clientelist political arrangement. So somebody can wake up and say, no, let me not use current examples. But a political decree can become policy overnight. And so sometimes, if it is intersecting with some of the demands of presence, of inclusion, it can then happen quickly, quicker than in democracies. Because you don't need to consult anybody. You can wake up and say, Prime Minister will be there, the Secretary to the Treasury will be there, and so on. It's different in democracies where there's a lot of competition and competition of ideas. Here you're dealing with highly personalized power. And one of the explanations is that it may happen that if the women's movement is posing questions of inclusion, they can be easily accommodated. Not to window dress, not to hoodwink anybody, but they can be easily accommodated, also intersecting with the need for new players in the power play. But then one needs to go ahead and see what is the effect or what is the impact. Because when it comes to now real substantive issues of gender transformation, you find that they hit a snag. The women's movement hits a snag, activism hits a snag. That is the issue with, for example, marriage laws across the continent, where you find that the law on domestic violence was passed quickly because people quickly agreed, and the dominant leaders also agreed. But when now you go to marriage law, you go to property rights, then you find that the situation changes. The regime no longer wants to window dress. It is outright rejection. So meaning that then the original thing about wanting to instrumentalize has now shifted gear, and you need to actually interrogate it a bit more. And this reminded me of one of the common complaints in the public domain. Somebody said in Luganda, abakazi mwe mutusibyeko Museveni. Who is a Muganda here? Any? Hey. Because if you translate it, okay, languages. Abakazi mwe mutusibyeko Museveni. What is the translation to English?
I may not get the right translation, but I think it's the women who are responsible for
women are largely responsible for keeping the leader in power. So this is on us, yes. You see, the other one has distance to the thing. So, the issue is, if you look at Parliament, for example, women are 34%, 34 point something. So the other 65 is male. So entrenching a regime cannot take the 35 without the 65. Mm-hmm. So when we say the inclusion of these at the helm has sort of helped in entrenching the regime, is also, on a slippery ground, and somehow women become the visible victims. So it's like the visible victims, especially when they are in those parliaments in their colorful dresses, they really become the substance of entrenchment. And I remember in 2015, there was also a public discussion of why women needed to get out of parliament, because they are the cause of all these bad laws and what. So that's a discussion in the public domain. I want to end with the role of the women's movement. And I think the author has put it really very well, the paradox. There isn't any choice. I think it's Mukandawire who said, choiceless democracy. There isn't any choice. But the women have remained resilient. And sometimes if you ask for bread and get crumbs that are falling off the table, sometimes you take them. And then the person who gave you crumbs is not really instrumentalizing you, but is keeping you somewhere for future use. So the role of the women's movement needs to be really foreground in these discussions, so that it also becomes a key player. Because if you see the explanation, for example, in Namibia, it's the women's movement that pushed for the 50-50. By the way, Namibia, I think, on the continent now is the front runner, because they have a legitimately voted president. Top 3 are female, but also, much more importantly, the 50-50 principle that runs up to the local level. What made this possible? Away from these autocracies that we are stuck with anyway, what made this possible? Why, for example, wouldn't it be possible in Botswana? They are both frontline, and now it seems that the dominant party, SWAPO, has something to explain the difference between Botswana and Namibia. And how I wish we had countries like Ghana, to be in the mix so that we are able to, countries like Kenya to be in the mix so that we are able to really interrogate these autocracies. And I remember when Ailey wrote about post-conflict, there was a huge debate as if she was arguing that conflict is good because the outcome looks like, it expands opportunities. So I hope that people will not read this book and say, autocracies? Okay, because they are bringing these people on top. So people have to read this book very critically because I remember that post-conflict debate. We almost exchanged blows. And Trip was saying, all I'm saying is that these conflict situations, first of all, destabilize all centers of power. Don't think that the state remains intact. And so in that rebuilding, there are opportunities that get opened up. And those are the cases with Rwanda, Uganda, Zimbabwe, and so on, and even Mauritania. And even the fact that these autocracies are also operating within the activity of power play. They're not as, one-way kind of thing as we think. So what this book does for us is really to ask more questions and challenges scholars on the African continent to broaden these issues. I hope that with a view of having these autocracies removed.
Yes,
Thank you very much.
Very insightful comments and observations, and I think that you really capture the complexity that I'm trying to bring to this discussion, that it's not simply all authoritarian countries are all wonderful, or democracies are all terrible, or whatever. I mean that there's a lot to pick apart here, and the more that you dig, the more complicated some of these issues get, and they're not easy answers. But no, at the end of the day, I do not want to be saying that we should have authoritarian rule. Of course, it's not. The biggest difference really is this issue of political liberties and civil rights. I mean, they just are so different from, Namibia is so different from a Zimbabwe when it comes to those kinds of concerns that, and any day I would, one would never want to experience the kinds of difficulties that people have in Zimbabwe. But just a few things to add to what you were saying. I completely agree that women have been part of the conflict, part of the autocracy, part of the, they're part and parcel of the problem as well. And so, and you see this, but they also themselves, and I didn't really bring this out so much in the talk, but they also themselves use, when they get into power, they can also use that power for themselves, and they can use it to promote women's rights issues, but they can also use it to promote themselves and to promote their own agendas, and they can use that power for their own benefit. And I saw in the book I talk quite a bit about the Zimbabwe case with Grace Mugabe, who has she plays this very complex role. She has both supported the Women's League and has pushed for certain pieces of key legislation and land rights for women and so on. And then she's also known as Gucci Grace, and she's also enriched herself, and she's also used the proximity to Robert Mugabe to promote her own power base, and then to eventually try to take power from him, and then to and she played the same game as the men did, the patronage politics game, the nasty factional politics that got very, very ugly at different times. And she also, but then at the same time, she's been called a whore, and she's been vilified for her engagement in politics, just like other women politicians. So it's very complex. It's not like there's a simple little story that one can skip out of here with. I also, the whole issue of the virtue signaling is a complicated one as well. One of the things that struck me was just even though of course people know that the foreign governments and donor countries are not sitting there being fooled, by all of these, the instrumentalization of women. I'm sure that that's the case, but at the same time, it's not simply just about donors, it's also about regional politics. It's also about the African Union is promoting these women's leadership. The ECOWAS is, SADC especially in Southern Africa. And one of the things that struck me was that when I talk to people, especially ministers, people in higher positions, they do pay attention to those indices, and they're paying attention to where their country ranks on maternal mortality and education and women's representation and so on. And so they are paying attention. They don't want to be laggards globally. They don't want to have to go to the CEDAW committee and committee on the status of women at the UN and report that nothing happened. So there is a certain sense of, these international pressures, but they're global, but they're also regional. They do have some impact. How much is I think is a good question to ask. And then Namibia and Botswana, one could have picked many different cases. I picked them because there were some similarities between them, but one was a post-conflict, one wasn't. Namibia has, and Botswana rank almost evenly when it comes to almost all measures around gender equality in Africa. They're the top two countries on a whole host of measures, from education to health to entrepreneurship and so on. But when it comes to, so they're either one or two, either Botswana or Namibia, they rank, and Namibia has a very active women's movement, Botswana doesn't. So, go figure. Why is that? And I think that's a puzzle for somebody who wants to write a nice dissertation. Why are they so different? But the big difference is that one is a post-conflict country, and that really has, I think, shaped Namibia in ways that, and in fact, that's what people in Botswana said, is that that's what the big difference between them and all their neighbors, Zimbabwe, South Africa, and Namibia, is that they didn't have the conflict aspect. And so they haven't changed. They're one of the few countries in Africa that hasn't revised their constitution. And so they haven't had that moment where they could have had some, more rapid change, perhaps. But in terms of women's representation, it's extremely low in Botswana, and it's in fact gone down. So let's maybe open it up for discussion.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to acknowledge the presence of some colleagues online. I saw Professor Tabitha Multiampiti. I think she has left. Oh, she's there. She's online. I've seen Dr. Daphne Nagaba, Professor Mwanguzi, and our PhD students.
Professor, for this wonderful discussion of your book. And I will not take much time because she will be on my neck. But thank you for bringing out this paradox of representation. In my opinion, this paradox of representation challenges us to look at other aspects in autocratic states. It should not be limited to the gender question only. Mm-hmm. It can be transferred and applied when we are looking at the paradox of representation regarding regional representation, ethnic representation, and as the discussant has pointed out, workers' representation, etc., etc. It is a paradox, and to understand this power dynamics in this paradox, I think we should use the lens of algebra and not arithmetic. See, the power dynamics issue is algebraic, not arithmetical. What I mean here is that if you have 2 times 4, is equal to 8, assuming we are using base 10. 4, you can see that the value of 4 is much more than the value of 2. But when you have 2A times 2B, or times 4B, you cannot be sure which one has a higher value. Is it 2A or 4B? You may find that unless you find out the value of A, you want to know whether 2A has a higher value or a lower value than 4B. That's what I mean by algebra versus arithmetic. So when you use the lens of arithmetic, you get it wrong. You can be participated. Autocratic regimes would want to look legitimate, and they will participate people. They will bring more people, add more people arithmetically, and participate you instead of participating, because they don't want to look to be the participating, and that would be exclusion, and they would lose legitimacy. So that is why I am excited about this book, and I will have time maybe and look and read it. And I would call upon all of us to be challenged about the whole paradox of representation. Very soon we are going to have cabinet, a new cabinet in Uganda. And you will see the arithmetic versus algebra. You find somebody is appointed a minister or prime minister, but his personal assistant or her personal assistant has more power of influence than the prime minister. That means we have to use algebra and not arithmetic.
Women's rights. Are we really appreciating and seeing how far we've gone? Because when we talk of women in politics and we talk about affirmative action, what is affirmative action? Somebody has been in that position for 35 years. Do you call that affirmative action? Somebody is a prime minister, somebody is a minister, and is stuck on the position of affirmative action. Look at here, prime ministers, speakers of parliament, they are all under affirmative action. They are competing with a girl who've just completed university. And you call that affirmative action as a woman movement person, women in movement. What are we doing about it? And we are sitting and watching. Then the second thing, still, in Lira City, a minister of gender contesting with Minister of Health on a position of affirmative action and leaving the other one to be taken up by a very weak man who does not even speak in parliament. Really? Do we know what we are talking about as women movement? Are we thinking right? Do we know what we want exactly? So somebody was telling me that the statement Mama said that Baganda said they blame women because they are the ones who make people to cling on power. It is true because we are useless. When I say this, don't understand. We are using our brain, our numerical strength less. So when you put it to be one word, you can you want to no, yeah, but we are not useless. We are using our brain, our numerical strength, the power of doing our work less. And at the end of the day, we are crying. Mama, I want to say one thing. The number of members of parliament who are women contesting in these other constituency positions are just dwindling every now and then. Why? Because for us as women movement, what are we doing about that to promote? I was a member of parliament on affirmative action. This time I contested with men. It is terrible, and there is no any other movement woman who can help you. You stand on your own. We had 6 sub-counties. I won in 4 sub-counties out of the 6. But they ended up declaring a man. During the time of declaration, even women could not come near me. I walk alone, solo. The place I was staying in was cordoned by army and police. So next time, no any other woman would think of contesting against a man, because you are actually breaking the stereotype of saying there are certain positions are really for men alone and not for women. So as women movement, as we talk about human rights and women in politics, we need to have a yardstick. How are we going to do this? If a woman goes on affirmative action, how many terms are you supposed to be in that position and you live for others? Before we start talking about men's things out there biting us, we must first clean our own house as women. What are we doing about it? How many women do we have in chairperson LC5?
Thank you.
In regards to voting and electoral systems, say for example, South Africa that has proportional representation in regards to democracy, and then Uganda that has majoritarian, like, do you find that there is a difference? Also, number two, and the last one from me is, unlike I think some people have said, they don't find maybe foreign interference and global issues as an issue for Uganda's women's rights. I think that is to be argued, because recently when you're seeing that global interest changing from diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I think you talk about that in the beginning of the book where you say the stature of the USA is affecting the rights down here. I think that's something that we need to take note of, because I feel like as Ugandan women, there's only so much we can do, but because governments are interested in not even just foreign interests, but foreign aid, I think if they stopped funding us, there would be very little that they listen to from maybe the global
There would be very
economy.
little that what? I can't hear.
Speak into the mic.
Sorry.
There would be very little what?
There would be very little that if they stopped funding Uganda, for example.
They have stopped funding.
I think the interest would be very limited in regards to respecting international commitments.
Yeah.
So what would that look like for us? Like, I'm not asking for a solution, because they've told me people who write books are not here to give solutions. They're here to just tell you what is there. But what could we do as a women's movement to then make sure that we remain in the same stature despite foreign interests changing and, going up and down? Thank you so much.
My first of all, thank you so much for a really interesting talk, and I'm very excited to read your book. My first question is with regards to sort of interlinking issues, particularly with questions of sort of ethnic patrimony or patrimony within ruling parties. I'm thinking actually more from a South Sudan context, where some people have spoken to me of positions allocated for women being given or like nominating the wives and daughters of prominent political officials, and them sort of being or people connected to key men within the regime. My other question is, and it'll just do two because I know that the time is limited, is what do we mean, and I wonder if there's a way to distinguish or think about questions of legitimacy or legitimizers on the world stage and legitimizers that are international and outward looking versus legitimizers that are inward looking or within a state. Mm-hmm. Are there differences in the ways that women are conducting themselves or entering office with regards to both of those questions of legitimacy? And how does this then relate to something that I think Professor Ndebesa was speaking to a little bit of what happens behind the scenes? How do you measure sort of products when electoral votes or public votes might not be the place where policy is decided or decisions are actually made within a state? Thank you very much.
Are trying to bring on board women. For the most part, they summon the language of democracy, liberal democracy, the politics of numbers. Does this in any way tell us something about the limits of liberal democracy in our post-colonial context? And of course, you talk about the whole idea of bringing on board women to suppress opposition, political parties, and civil liberties. Mm-hmm. Is it just that, or is it also about trying to reduce the number of fronts on which power is being challenged? For instance, the womenist and feminist movements that can come and challenge the way power is being practiced, issues of exclusion and marginalization. And lastly, are these women just onboarded as just women? Or are there other categories that define these women and their subjecthood, racialized women, classed women, and all of that, to ensure that they are being exploited, more marginalized than others? Thank you.
Imply that the female gender is more autocratic than the others? Does this topic imply that the female gender is more autocratic than the others? The second question, could the presenter talk a bit more about what role development partners and donors have played in this instrumentalization of women leaders by autocratic governments, especially in Eastern African region? Have they played into it, especially in its insidious nature, such as the tokenization of women, or even the overemphasis on numbers instead of transformational shifts? That's Daphne Nagawa. Thank you for the book. It speaks closely to my research on symbolic inclusion of women in politics in Kenya. However, I'm wondering how you conceptualize regimes. For instance, in cases like Kenya, which is formally democratic with multi-party and elections, but often operates through more authoritarian logics. In this case, doesn't the distinction between democracy and autocracy and authoritarianism risk obscuring how power operates and ultimately the realities of women's representation? That's Cynthia Atata from MISA. Trip, thank you for the amazing work. Patronage appears to be undermining women's autonomy in the current political space. That statement ends there. So if I can sneak in one small one for holding the mic. Yes. Autocracy. I just wanted to know how you conceptualize autocracy, especially when you categorize these countries. Is autocracy universal, a stable category that you're looking at? Or are there changes or variations in autocratic regimes? And the second one could come around the nature of the gender agenda. And picking up from the discussant, when you look at Uganda in 1986-89, and the motives around the gender question, they seem not to have been longevity and stay in power, at least on the onset.
Right.
So how do we draw on the aspect of change as we map these histories to tell what the motive was and how the motive shifted at a particular moment?
Thank you, Joanne. I've seen again a second hand up, Dr. David Shimba. I really am sorry. I think these are very many questions.
It is 4 o'clock.
It's 4 o'clock. Yes, you can hear you, David. Go ahead and give your comment.
Heidi, for this highly commended book, I was wondering whether we could have had another argument had she perhaps looked at these cases on the continent led by women. How does the story become when and where these autocracies or semi-autocracies were led by women? Does the argument still hold that the women in political with political power, are they also having this instrumentalization of women, whether from women movements or whether from pressure from below or pressure from above? Did it change, for example, in Sierra Leone under Salif? Did you see something else? Are we seeing something else with Namibia now under this woman president. Is the story going to be different in post-genocide Rwanda? I know we are getting into speculations, but historically speaking, when Africa had women leaders, did they everything else remain constant? That for me is what I would like to hear from you. But I also want to say, I'll commend you really for bringing complexity about the Ugandan case. It seems to me that we have more of a car. The case of Uganda is really a manual car. The leadership is pressing the accelerator on some front as far as this women's rights is concerned, and the women activist movement are pressing the clutch. And when the accelerator and the clutch are pressed at the same time, then you have some intentional inertia. There's no movement forward or backward, and I think there is a whole argument about how to produce, how we are producing inertia, not backlash or movement forward. But it's a fantastic story of production of inertia. But that's my reading of how to present the case of Uganda. Thanks.
Okay, we shall have Eileen respond to those questions in 5 minutes.
All right. Okay, here we go. Yes, no, no. Yeah, no, thank you. These are wonderful questions. These are wonderful questions. No, really, these are, and I hope a lot of others also took notes. I can hardly read my handwriting, but because a lot of these are really good foundational questions for dissertations or for term papers and so on. A lot of these are really good research questions. I don't have the answers to all of them, but I'll tell you what I think so far on some of them. I mean, this last question that David Chimba asked regarding women in power. I mean, we can look to your neighbor, to Tanzania, where you have a woman president, and it was a semi-authoritarian country, and now it just shifted after October into a full-blown authoritarian regime, and things started out one way in a very positive direction, and then with the enormous election violence. I mean, people say from 1,000 to 10,000 were killed in the violence. I think it points to the fact that we're not talking about just women, we're talking about gender here. And women are part of gender relations, and women are part of gender regimes, and women are part of patriarchal regimes as well. And they can work for them or against them. And you've seen, I think in that case that, I mean, I'm on my way to Tanzania on May the 7th, and I will be, looking at questions of, I'm going to do some research there on the changing role of U.S. aid and U.S. policy towards UN and how it's affecting women's mobilization. But I'm sure I will hear about what's happened and how having a woman president made a difference or didn't make a difference. But I feel like Suluhu is part of she's part of a patriarchal regime, and she's operating under those rules and those imperatives. And it's not, as maybe as a woman, but she's definitely part of that structure. So I think that's how we have to think about these regimes. Also, and that was my point with Grace Mugabe, that she's part of a system, and she also operates with those logics. In terms of, someone asked for to define regime. Regime is a political system. That's kind of how it can be democratic, it can be autocratic, there's totalitarian, there's different kinds of regimes. Somebody asked about what difference does the regime make. I think I did highlight that there's, one thing that we do know is that regimes that have political parties in power actually tend to do better for women's rights compared to military regimes or regimes that are led monarchies or personalistic regimes. So the more that there's a political base in a political party, those regimes tend to do better. So I feel like I did kind of, at least somewhat address that, and I go into greater detail in the book on that. Then there was a question about proportional representation. Yes, that matters. In Europe, it's a huge issue. It is one of the main factors that differentiate countries that do better for women's leadership than countries that don't do well, if they have a proportional representation party list system. But in Africa, if you look statistically, yes, South Africa does do better than other countries PR systems generally, some of them will do better, but statistically it doesn't stand out as a factor. When you take into consideration quotas and post-conflict factors and other things, it doesn't emerge as a major, it's important, but it's not a major explanatory factor. The question about U.S. aid is an important one, and I just want to say one more time, thank you so much, Namata Tenda. You made my Uganda chapter possible. I mean, if I couldn't have done it without her help, because I was, in the U.S. and this is the first time I'm meeting her, but we've talked a lot on. So I knew her from what she looks like on Zoom, but not otherwise. And so I really just want to, from the bottom of my heart, thank you for your contribution. It was really critical. But anyway, the question about what happens with changes in donor aid, I mean, that is a really important one right now, because it's not, U.S.'s role is changing. U.S. aid has been closed down. Some money still trickles out of the State Department, but it's given on a very transactional basis and a very problematic basis. It's being given like in exchange for minerals. It's being given in exchange for data on, Kenya just has been having a debate over giving data, health data for health in exchange for health funding and so on. So, and then the U.S., but the other thing that the U.S. has done is it's pulled out of 66 UN agencies, including UN Women. So this means that that these agencies are defunded, UNDP, all of them, and they're merging United Nations Population Fund with UN Women. All of this is going to have huge impacts on the ground and it's going to affect women's movements if it hasn't already. Certainly the humanitarian aid already has affected people. So how, and whether or not there's other actors that can pick up some of that funding remains to be seen. Not to mention the fact that U.S. is playing a very dangerous role right now. It's warmongering. It's a rogue state. It's acting unilaterally. It's not cooperating with its traditional allies. All of this injects a huge amount of instability into the global system. And I think that this, it's not the whole story, but it's something that we have to pay attention to. How does that affect people in other parts of the world, and how does the instability affect people, and how does, the U.S. is now also changing its, for whatever, might have been hypocritical and so on, but in the past, but now it no longer is supporting human rights. These things do have consequences, but to what extent, and to what extent can women's movements locally, push back against those trends? That remains to be seen. They've taken out the word gender they've tried to take it out of UN language. They've tried to take out, even in my university, we've lost our grants. Any grant that has the word gender in it gets dropped. Somehow, miraculously, I kept on to my National Science Foundation grant. Don't tell anybody, but I kept on. I have all the bad words in there: inclusion, diversity, gender, women. bad words. But this is scary for me. This is a step backwards. We're not moving forwards. So all of these can have repercussions globally, and maybe this is the moment for the global South to make a stand and to really push back and change norms. Okay, how are we doing? That clock is not moving, unless I spoke really fast. That was algebra. Oh, and that was a nice point that Mabasa made about and I think also Rebecca about the kind of what happens behind the scenes and the informal politics that certainly drives politics. For women, but also for men, and who wins and who loses. All of that matters. So it's difficult to study, and but it's extremely important. And yes, I agree. The numbers won't show that. You have to do in-depth work with, and get life stories and talk to people to get that dimension. Then there's a very important point also about the limits of democracy. I think it's a good. How do you say it, corrective because democratic states also instrumentalize women. Trust me, they do. I know this. But to what end? And is it done differently? And And, does it have the same consequences? Like in Namibia, the opposition operates freely. They don't, and same thing with Botswana. Both the ruling parties in both those countries do not play the vote-sharing game, and they don't pay attention to that, and they do promote women who are not in the opposition, who are in the opposition. And I talk about that in the book. So I think it's a very, very different scenario than it is for the authoritarian countries that do everything they can to squish the opposition. And then there was also another point, a question about are women acting as in different, the question of intersectionality. Do they operate as women or also with other dimensions to their identity? Could be ethnicity, could be class, it could be age. All of these, I completely agree, all of these things are factors, but this is for somebody else to take on and go more in detail. I do talk about some of that in the book in terms of LGBTQ issues and age, but I think because that was one dimension that popped out really strongly, that there is some differences between older and younger women in terms of the women's movements and their ambitions. But that would be a wonderful question for people to pursue further in their studies. So thank you very much. Thank you for this opportunity to learn from you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much for the engagement. I would like to thank the online audience for staying with us up to now. I'd also like to thank the people in the room for staying up to this moment. If we had more time, I think this is a very engaging topic that we would still continue discussing until darkness comes. I think at one point even they said the best dancer leaves the floor, so we are going to stop at this point, our conundrum where you talk about, this raises more questions, and perhaps we have to do more investigations upon this, because the take home that I have is the virtue signaling. I think I loved that that expression. I hadn't come across that concept. And what I read from your presentation, you said China, which does not pay attention to gender rankings in its foreign relations, has become Africa's largest trading partner, with 1/5 of the continent's exports coming from China, and trade with Europe is declining. Yeah. So you can see that there's a lot of contradiction, much as the US is withdrawing, and we're trading with China, and China doesn't care really much about these gender rankings. So where are we going to go? It looks like we have more questions to answer when it comes to this issue of instrumentalizing even gender itself, and how it will lead to our women's empowerment. I want to thank you all for coming. We are now moving to the last session where we are going to have a gift that we want to give to our guest. Our guest. Our speaker tonight, there are 2 books and method from Makerere University, Debates and Insights, and the latest publication, which is volume 17.
Florence Ebila and for Eamon Mwina, who helped organize this event. Both of you helped organize this event. Thank you so much. Thank you. Appreciate it. I'll write in it later. Okay. Yeah.